First insight as to the plans that Donald Trump has should he reassume the White House by way of a new cover story in Time magazine. And let's talk with the author of that piece. He's Time national politics reporter Eric Cortollessa up late with me tonight here on the Final Five. Eric, good to see you again.
Good to be with you.
The cover says if he wins, and what struck me, I think, right off the bat was he said his biggest regret for the first 4 years of his term was that he was too nice.
Yeah, I mean, I asked him this in the context of the dozens of former cabinet officials who refuse to endorse Trump for re-election in 2024. And he told me that he regrets giving them the opportunity to resign. He would say, hand me a letter. He says that was a gentlemanly thing to do. Next time he says he won't be so nice, next time he'll fire. And that little bit of insight provides a greater window into Trump's mind. This is someone who is planning to come into office a second term if he wins and consolidate the powers of the government around the presidency so that he can impose his will and his agenda going forward and not be stymied by the guardrails that were in place last time.
One of the most striking stances I think he takes, and shouldn't be surprised judging on what we've seen play out in Georgia and New York and elsewhere, is he really has his eyes laser focused on the DOJ and the control that he sees the White House in a Trump second term holding over what is traditionally an independent judiciary.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that Donald Trump said to me is that he would be willing to intervene more directly in prosecutions than presidents have in the past. When I asked him whether he would be willing to fire a U.S. attorney who refused his orders to prosecute someone, Trump said to me it would depend on the situation, but that, yes, it was certainly something he would be willing to do. And, you know, that has a lot of implications for the credibility of American law enforcement and the independence of prosecutors in that agency. It's a concept and a principle that dates back to America's founding.
A lot of the people around Trump in this second iteration or this third iteration of a campaign have been from the conservative realm, people like Mike Davis, who joined me a while back. And people like Mike Davis had been saying, you know, when there's another Trump term, that the mass deportations are going to begin. And he cited something like 11 million undocumented immigrants they would like to deport at the same time. And this is something that Trump sort of touched upon with you.
He remains fixated on immigration. I mean, immigration has been one of Trump's main preoccupations since the dawn of his political rise. And if there's one area above all the others he's planning to be extremely aggressive on, it's immigration. He plans on day one to sign a slew of executive orders that would close the border, as he says, which really means he would re-implement a lot of the policies that he had in place in first term, such as Remain in Mexico, Title 42. He would deploy resources and allocate military funding to build a border wall, but he's also going to embark on a massive deportation operation, as he puts it, which would be designed to remove as many or more than 11 million migrants from the country. He told me he'd be willing to send in the National Guard throughout the country to find and haul away these migrants. He'd be willing to create incentives for local and state police departments to participate by tying federal funding to their involvement. And most strikingly, Trump said he'd be willing to use the military if necessary. Now, it needs to be said, the Posse Comitatus Act, which is an arcane statute, but it is the law of the land, says you cannot deploy the military on civilians. When I asked Trump if he would override that, he said he did not consider undocumented migrants civilians.
So here we are in the middle of this presidential campaign, which is taking place in the middle of these court proceedings in New York City, which you were sort of there as part of this whole process of speaking to the former president. And what we're seeing is a different campaign apparatus. The faces are different this time around. We know in 2016 there was a lot of backbiting, there was a lot of back and forth, but it seems like it's a little more laser focused on a few core advisors who were shaping the message, which is why we're really not seeing that back and forth that we saw when Manafort and those likes were running the show.
Donald Trump has very deliberately tried to avoid any of the internecine infighting that roiled his first administration. You know, one of the reasons why there were so many leaks and why there was so much chaos and dysfunction is that he had these feuding tribes within the White House and within his inner circle even. And that meant that they were always out to get one another. Donald Trump doesn't want that this time. He wants a disciplined group of true believers who are committed to his vision and carrying it out effectively.
Were you surprised that he was as open as he was with these plans?
Well, he didn't just come out and say them. I had to keep pressing him for it. So I suppose I wasn't too surprised. I think that Donald Trump hides in plain sight in a lot of ways. I think he tells us precisely what he wants to do. I think he can dodge questions for sure. He can be cagey. We know that he can sometimes have a tenuous relationship with the truth. But I think that Donald Trump is campaigning on the agenda he wants to implement as president. And, the opportunity that I had to speak with him twice gave me that chance to press him on the details so that we could write a full and fair, comprehensive story that would illustrate, in Trump's own words, what he would do if he returns to the White House, that our readers and the American voting public can make the most informed decision possible.
The piece is called If He Wins. It's in Time Magazine. Eric Cortollessa, the author and the journalist. Thanks for joining me, Eric. Good to see you again.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Final Five is back after this.